9-year-old Betty Paris collapsed to the floor, her body jerking as if invisible hands were twisting her limbs. Beside her, 11-year-old Abigail Williams let out a scream that rattled the wooden walls of the parsonage. Their mouths foamed, their backs arched, their voices poured out in words that no child should know. The neighbors who crowded into Reverend Paris's home whispered the only explanation their world could hold. Salem Village had been touched by the devil. The winter air of 1692 hung heavy over Salem Village. Snow crusted the rooftops, hearth fires smoked against the grey sky, and inside the minister's house, 2 young girls convulsed in terror. At first, no one dared question the cause. Salem was already a town on edge. Wolves prowled the forests. Disease swept through homes without warning. Armed raids from the frontier haunted every settler's memory. And now, the devil's servants were said to be stalking their neighbors. But beneath the surface of this supposed haunting lay a truth far more human and far more disturbing. The girls had been playing a forbidden game. In the kitchen hearth of Reverend Paris's home, guided by the whispered tales of Tituba, the enslaved woman in the household, they cracked an egg into a glass of water. Gazing into the shifting yolk, they hoped to glimpse the shape of their future husbands. Instead, the image seemed to twist into something darker, a coffin, a shadow, a symbol of death. And in Puritan Salem, the punishment for dabbling in forbidden magic was severe. Faced with exposure, Betty and Abigail transformed their guilt into victimhood. They claimed they were not the sinners, but the targets. They were being tormented by witches. That choice would spark a chain of events that left more than 20 people dead. Soon, other girls joined the frenzy. Mercy Lewis, Ann Putnam Jr., Mary Walcott. They shrieked, they clawed at their bodies. They accused invisible hands of pinching and stabbing them, and to the townsfolk of Salem, it seemed undeniable. Witches walked among them. Yet if you strip away the hysteria, another picture emerges. These were young women, with no voice in society, suddenly able to command the attention of magistrates, ministers, and crowds. In a world that silenced them, their screams gave them power, but power in Salem was bought with blood. The first names spoken were not chosen by chance. They were the weak, the defenseless, the unwanted. Tituba, the enslaved woman. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar. Sarah Osborne, an elderly widow who had scandalized Salem by living with a man before marriage. They were perfect scapegoats. None held wealth, power, or protection. None had allies willing to risk their own lives in defense. The machinery of accusation had found its first victims. When these women were dragged before the court, the scene became a performance of cruelty. The girls collapsed in shrieking fits. The moment the accused entered the room, every denial was twisted into proof of guilt. Every calm word became a sign of diabolical cunning. The judges demanded confessions, and the accused quickly realized the terrible logic of Salem. To insist on innocence was to guarantee the noose. Tituba understood this most clearly. Surrounded by hostile judges and screaming children, she surrendered to the theater. She confessed, not just to witchcraft, but to a sprawling conspiracy. She spoke of strange animals, shadowy figures, and a book signed in blood. It was a fabrication, but it was also exactly what her interrogators longed to hear. And so, Tituba lived, but her survival fed the hysteria. Her words gave the judges license to expand the hunt. Sarah Good was less fortunate. Dragged into court in rags, she stood defiant, denying the charges even as the girls convulsed at the sight of her. "Why do you torment these poor children?" the magistrate demanded. Her refusal to confess was twisted into proof that she was hardened in Satan's service. Sarah Osborne fared no better. Frail, bedridden, her scandalous past, a lover before marriage, a bitter inheritance dispute, was paraded as evidence of diabolic corruption. She was condemned not for witchcraft, but for failing to meet Salem's rigid image of purity. By the time these first women were accused, the village was already transformed. Fear bled into every household. The question was no longer whether witches walked among them. The only question now was who would be next. And as Salem soon discovered, once the machinery of accusation began to turn, it would not stop until blood soaked the gallows. The girls had saved themselves, but they had condemned their village. This was only the beginning. Next you'll see how Salem's courts twisted confessions, turned neighbors against each other, and made truth itself a crime. Hit like, tap subscribe, and ring the bell, because it helps us keep making great content. Now, We step into the courtroom where innocence was no defense, and silence was a death sentence. The courtroom in Salem was not a place of justice. It was a stage. The air smelled of sweat, damp wool, and the faint smoke of hearth fires. Wooden benches groaned under the weight of neighbors eager to witness the spectacle. At the front sat the magistrates, John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, their faces set in grim righteousness. And before them stood three women, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne, accused of serving the devil himself. The girls who had started the storm sat in full view, trembling and gasping, their eyes wide as if invisible hands clawed at them. At the slightest denial from the accused, they shrieked, their bodies convulsing in synchronized horror. It was theater, and everyone played their part. The judges asked their questions not to discover truth, but to extract submission. Guilt had already been decided. The performance was merely to supply justification. Sarah Good, ragged and pregnant, clutched her swollen belly as Hathorne demanded she confess. "Why do you torment these children?" he asked. Her protest, that she did no such thing, was twisted into proof that she was hardened in Satan's service. Each refusal, each denial, only made the girls scream louder, the crowd murmur darker. She was poor, a beggar, an irritation to the village. Now she was a witch, and her fate was sealed. Sarah Osborne fared no better, weak from illness. She barely managed to stand. Her reputation was already tarnished. Years earlier she had scandalized Salem by living with a man before marriage, an act that Puritans saw as moral corruption. She had been locked in bitter disputes over her late husband's estate, making enemies who were only too eager to see her condemned. In the eyes of the magistrates, Osborne's infirm body was proof of spiritual rot. Her weakness was reframed as evidence of possession. But it was Tituba, whose performance ensured the trials would not stop with these three women. Enslaved, vulnerable, and with no allies in Salem, she understood the deadly game unfolding before her. Denial meant execution. Defiance meant torture. The only path to survival was to feed the court exactly what it hungered for. So she confessed, and not just to small sins but to a sprawling nightmare. She spoke of black dogs, strange birds, shadowy figures who pressed her to sign a book with blood. She claimed there were other witches, dozens more, conspiring to destroy Salem from within. Her testimony was elaborate, vivid, terrifying, and it was a lie designed to keep her alive. The magistrates leaned forward, rapt. The audience gasped. The afflicted girls screamed with renewed vigor, their fits perfectly timed to confirm Tituba's story. What had begun as the punishment of three outcasts suddenly became the unveiling of a vast conspiracy. Salem was no longer rooting out a handful of sinners, it was at war with an invisible army. Tituba's confession created a new rule. Survival depended on compliance. To deny guilt was to die. To confess was to live, but only if you dragged others down with you. The system was diabolical in its simplicity. Each confession demanded more names. Each name created new trials, and each trial generated more fear. Salem had discovered a machine that could feed on itself endlessly. Sarah Good, unlike Tituba, refused to surrender to the lie. When pressed to name accomplices, she spat defiance. Witnesses reported that she muttered under her breath when denied charity, and these mutterings were reframed as curses. When asked why she harmed children, she answered with clarity, she had harmed no one. The court heard this as the devil speaking through her. Pregnant, destitute, and with no allies, she was marked for the gallows. Even her young daughter Dorothy, barely 4 years old, was thrown into jail, accused of witchcraft by association. The child sobbed in terror as she was led away, her small hands clutching at air. Salem had reached the point where even innocence itself was branded guilty. The interrogations were not trials in any recognizable sense. They were traps designed to make denial impossible. If an accused person stumbled while reciting the Lord's Prayer, it was proof of Satan's interference. If they performed the prayer perfectly, it was proof that the devil had given them strength to deceive. If a woman bore an unusual mark on her skin, it was declared the devil's brand. If she had no marks at all, it was proof she had hidden them. Every path led back to guilt. The afflicted girls had discovered their own terrifying power. When an accused woman lifted a hand to her face, the girls mirrored the movement, crying that they were being forced to mimic her actions. When the accused denied the charges, the girls collapsed, writhing in agony. The magistrates nodded gravely, convinced they were witnessing spiritual warfare. The girls' every gesture was treated as infallible evidence. Their screams carried more weight than sermons, more authority than scripture. They had become arbiters of life and death. The most chilling feature of these proceedings was how quickly the community embraced them. Neighbors who had long resented Sarah Osborne's inheritance disputes now whispered eagerly of her witchcraft. Families who had once turned Sarah Good from their doors with disdain now muttered that they had always suspected her. Salem's divisions, economic, personal, spiritual, found their perfect outlet in accusation. The devil was not an outside invader. He was the mask through which Salem's citizens devoured one another. When Tituba's elaborate confession reached its climax, the judges seized on her every word. A book with many names, she claimed, had been shown to her by the devil himself. She had signed it in blood, and she had seen others sign as well. "How many names did you see?" they demanded. Tituba paused, then answered, "Many, more than she could count." The implication was clear. Witches were everywhere. No one was safe. In that moment, Salem changed forever. A beggar, a sick widow, and an enslaved woman had been enough to ignite suspicion. But Tituba's words transformed suspicion into certainty. Now the village believed itself surrounded. The hunt would not stop with the powerless. It would expand to touch ministers, merchants, mothers, fathers, even children. No one was beyond reach. As the session ended, the crowd spilled out into the cold night, their breath clouding in the air. Some whispered fearfully of the devil's growing presence. Others spoke eagerly of who might be accused next. Inside, the magistrates congratulated themselves on their righteous duty. Outside, neighbors looked at one another with new suspicion. Every glance, every muttered word, every old grievance could be reinterpreted as proof of witchcraft. The Salem Witch Trials had begun their terrible rhythm. Accusation, interrogation, confession, expansion, each step feeding the next. Each new victim ensuring there would be more to follow. What had begun with the writhing bodies of two little girls had become a machine designed to turn neighbor into executioner. And as Salem soon learned, once the first blood is spilled, it becomes far too easy to demand more. The courthouse was packed, the air thick with breath and tension. Ordinary villagers crowded shoulder to shoulder, craning their necks to glimpse the accused. The magistrates sat like stone, their black robes a shadow against the wood, and in the center stood the accused, trembling, knowing there was no escape. This was not a trial, it was a ritual, a performance of power designed to turn accusation into execution. The outcome was already decided. The only question was how the court would force guilt to reveal itself. In Salem, the rules of justice had been inverted. The accused were guilty until proven innocent, but innocence itself was impossible to prove. The burden was not on the accusers to demonstrate crime. It was on the accused to explain how they were not witches, an impossible task in a system built on circular logic. When Sarah Good denied tormenting the afflicted children, Hathorne leaned forward with cold certainty. "Why do you not confess? Why do you thus torment these poor children?" Her refusal to accept guilt was twisted into proof that she was lying. Each denial was another nail in her coffin. The logic of the trials was as cruel as it was elegant. If you confessed, you were spared execution, but only if you named others. If you denied, you were guilty, because the children's screams proved your guilt. Every word, every breath, every gesture could be turned into evidence against you. The system had become airtight, a trap that left no room for truth. One of the most grotesque tools of this system was spectral evidence. A claim that someone had seen the ghostly form, the specter of the accused tormenting them in dreams or visions, was accepted as fact. No witnesses, no corroboration, no physical proof, just the word of an afflicted girl writhing in the dirt. It was impossible to defend against. If you argued you had been elsewhere, the court decided your spirit could travel independently. If you pointed out the absurdity of the claim, your skepticism was seen as proof that you were in league with the devil. Even the act of appearing calm in the courtroom could be reframed as cunning deception granted by Satan. Every outcome fed the machine. Good behavior, bad behavior, no behavior at all. All of it was interpreted as guilt. The examinations became theater. The afflicted girls screamed, clawed at invisible attackers, and fell into fits the moment an accused woman spoke. The court did not dismiss this hysteria, they encouraged it. Magistrates demanded the accused explain why their spectre was hurting the children. They demanded that witches call back their wandering spirits, as if such things were rational commands. During Bridget Bishop's trial, the afflicted shrieked that her spectre pinched them and pressed on their chests. Hathorne demanded to know why Bishop's very coat seemed to attack the girls. When she denied it, the denial itself became proof. Salem's judges had reached a level of intellectual dishonesty so complete that reality itself no longer mattered. The trials were not about truth. They were about validation. The court had already decided witches were real, and every cry, every fit, every false confession was taken as evidence to confirm what they already believed. Confessions became the court's favorite weapon. Unlike in most legal systems, where confession marked the end of judgment, in Salem confession became the beginning of cooperation. Those who confessed were kept alive as long as they provided new names, new accusations, new fuel for the fire. The innocent died on the gallows, but the liars lived, as long as their lies fed the machine. Tituba's elaborate confession had set the pattern. Others followed, learning that life could be bought if they were willing to drag their neighbors down with them. The court rewarded detail, elaboration, spectacle. The more lurid the confession, the more valuable it became. Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old, frail and hard of hearing, refused to play the game. She denied guilt to the very end, insisting she had never served Satan. For her honesty, she was condemned. John Proctor, a respected farmer, likewise refused to stain his conscience with a lie. His refusal to confess cost him his life. In Salem, the innocent were executed while the guilty were kept alive, as long as they agreed to lie convincingly. The cruelty of this system was most visible in the case of George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village. Burroughs had enemies in the town, bitter disputes left unresolved from his time as minister. When accusations turned toward him, the evidence was laughably thin. His unusual strength was presented as supernatural. His ability to recite scripture from memory was declared evidence of demonic cunning. When Burroughs stood on the gallows, he prayed aloud, reciting the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, something witches were supposedly incapable of doing. The crowd was shaken. For a moment, doubt flickered across Salem. Surely a man who could pray so beautifully was no servant of Satan. But Cotton Mather silenced their doubts, reminding them that even the devil could appear as an angel of light. Burroughs was executed, his dignity twisted into proof of guilt. It was a perfect example of Salem's perverse logic. Any evidence, no matter how contradictory, was reshaped to fit the conclusion that witches were guilty. In this nightmare, even silence was fatal. Martha Corey, skeptical of the trials, had spoken openly that the afflicted girls might be lying. When accusations turned toward her, her past skepticism was used as evidence against her. Who but a witch, they reasoned, would question the godly work of rooting out witches? Giles Corey, her husband, would later pay the ultimate price for this corruption. Accused himself, he refused to enter a plea. For that refusal, he was pressed to death beneath heavy stones. His last words were more weight, a defiance that outlived the court that crushed him. By the summer of 1692, Salem's machinery of guilt had been perfected. The girls screamed, the judges nodded, the accused were trapped in a web with no escape. The courtroom had become an engine of death, fueled by fear, suspicion, and the willingness of neighbors to condemn one another. The accused entered as villagers, they left as witches, and when the rope tightened around their necks, Salem congratulated itself on a job well done. The witch hunt was no longer confined to beggars, widows, or servants. The circle of suspicion had widened, and accusation had become a weapon sharper than any blade. In Salem, to speak someone's name in the wrong tone could end their life. Old grudges, hidden jealousies, and property disputes suddenly had divine sanction. The devil became the excuse through which neighbors destroyed one another. The case of Rebecca Nurse showed this with brutal clarity. 71 years old, frail and deeply pious, she was the kind of woman whose reputation should have made accusation unthinkable. For decades, she had cared for the sick, offered prayers in times of grief, and earned the respect of her community. Yet she also belonged to the Nurse family, locked in a bitter feud with the powerful Putnam clan over land boundaries. When the afflicted girls began to shriek that her spectre tormented them, the accusations carried the unmistakable fingerprints of her enemies. At first, even the court hesitated. The sheer absurdity of condemning Rebecca Nurse forced them to pause. 39 neighbors signed a petition declaring her innocence, vouching for her character, but petitions became dangerous in Salem. To defend the accused was to risk suspicion yourself. Those who stood for Nurse soon found their loyalty questioned. The circle of fear expanded, swallowing friend and ally alike. The Nurse case proved something chilling. No reputation, no matter how pure, could shield a person once accusation took hold. Virtue itself could be twisted into a mask for Satan's cunning. Rebecca Nurse was condemned. Her execution sent a message. If even a grandmother known for her piety could be named a witch, then no one was safe. The pattern of feuds masquerading as spiritual warfare repeated across the village. The map of accusations revealed it clearly. Most of the accused lived on the eastern side of Salem, while the majority of accusers came from the west. The division mirrored the town's long-running political and economic battles, a split over land, over ministers, over the very identity of the village. The trials became an extension of this civil war, with witchcraft as the weapon of choice. Property disputes in particular drove many accusations. Land was survival in New England. Generations fought bitterly over inheritance, boundary lines and titles. In Salem, accusation could achieve what lawsuits never could. Once convicted, a witch's property could be seized, redistributed, or stripped from their heirs. The trials created the largest forced transfer of property in the colony's history. It was not just paranoia, it was opportunism cloaked in piety. Martha Carrier's story captured this perfectly. Outspoken, intelligent, and unwilling to bend to her neighbors, she had long made enemies. Her family's successful farm sparked envy, and her sharp tongue bred resentment. When the hysteria spread, she was swiftly accused of being the queen of hell, supposedly commanding legions of demons. Behind the language of diabolic grandeur lay something simpler: jealousy, rivalry, and a chance to ruin a prosperous household. The accusations multiplied. Carrier's own children were pressured into testifying against her, repeating the tales demanded by magistrates. Salem had reached a point where children denounced their parents, tearing families apart from within. Carrier never confessed. For her defiance, she was hanged in August. Her land passed to others. The trials also became a brutal form of patriarchal enforcement. Women who stepped outside the narrow boundaries of Puritan femininity were especially vulnerable. Independence itself was treated as evidence of witchcraft. Bridget Bishop, a tavern keeper executed in June, was condemned as much for her lifestyle as for any supposed crime. She wore bright clothing in a society that valued somber modesty. She had married multiple times, survived husbands, and managed her own affairs. She represented everything that unsettled the Puritan order, a woman who refused to be invisible. Her death was a warning to others. Economic competition was another hidden fuel. John Proctor, one of the most outspoken critics of the trials, owned a successful farm and tavern. His refusal to remain silent, combined with his prosperity, made him a target. By accusing him of witchcraft, rivals not only silenced his dissent, but also positioned themselves to profit from the seizure of his property. Salem's courts had transformed into a grotesque marketplace, where accusation became currency. Sheriffs and jailers collected fees from prisoners' families. Ministers gained prestige by guiding the condemned. Neighbors eyed one another's land with sudden hunger. Justice was no longer blind. It was for sale. The accused learned quickly that opposition was impossible. To question the trials was to invite suspicion. Martha Corey discovered this when she expressed doubts about the girls' performances. Within days she herself was accused, her skepticism reframed as evidence that she was trying to shield fellow witches. Her arrest sent another message: dissent would not be tolerated. Silence was safer than reason. The result was a community paralyzed by fear. Neighbors who had shared meals now crossed the street to avoid each other. Parents eyed their children nervously, knowing that the wrong word at the wrong moment could be repeated in court. Husbands betrayed wives, daughters testified against mothers. Families disintegrated under the crushing weight of accusation, and the accusers, the young girls at the center of it all, discovered their power had no limits. Each fit, each scream, each pointed finger brought the community to its knees. They could topple respected ministers, prosperous merchants, and beloved grandmothers with a single performance. In a society that silenced women, they had found a voice, but their voice was a weapon that destroyed lives. By midsummer, the trials had consumed the village. Old disputes over fences, debts, and marriages resurfaced as charges of witchcraft. The language was spiritual, but the motives were earthly. Every hanging was not just the defeat of a supposed servant of Satan, but the settling of a score, the erasure of an enemy, the division of property. The gallows on Gallows Hill became the stage where jealousy, greed, and vengeance dressed themselves as holy war. And with each execution, the crowd was reminded that anyone could be next. Salem was no longer hunting witches. Salem was devouring itself. The meeting house in Salem Village had become less a court and more a stage. Crowds gathered not just to witness justice, but to watch a performance that blurred the line between law and spectacle. At the center of it all were the afflicted girls, whose contortions and shrieks had become the most powerful evidence in Massachusetts. Every session was theater, and the audience demanded a show. The girls had refined their act with chilling precision. When an accused person entered the room, they collapsed to the floor as if struck. If the accused lifted a hand, the girls mirrored the gesture, screaming that invisible forces compelled them. When questioned by magistrates, they writhed, shrieked, and fell into spasms that stopped only when the court demanded the accused call back their specters. The girls held the entire village captive in a play they alone directed. For judges steeped in fear of the devil, the spectacle was irresistible. The cries of children were treated as divine evidence, the visible proof of invisible warfare. Reason had no place here. The louder the screams, the more convinced the court became that Satan was present in the room. Spectators gasped, prayed, and whispered. Some claimed they saw shadows moving along the walls. Others swore they felt the air grow colder when the accused denied guilt. The hysteria was contagious. People who had arrived skeptical left certain they had witnessed a battle between heaven and hell. This was the genius of the trials. They had become self-sustaining theater. The girls performed, the magistrates validated, the crowd believed, and the accused were condemned. Each role reinforced the others. The play never ended, only expanded. The victims were forced participants in this performance. During examinations they stood surrounded by shrieking girls and hostile judges, unable to speak without their words being twisted. If they protested, the fits grew worse. If they remained silent, their silence was taken as guilt. They could not win, because the performance required a villain, and they had already been cast in the role. Even death was staged for maximum effect. Executions became public rituals, designed to prove the righteousness of the cause. The condemned were marched to the gallows before crowds of hundreds. Prayers were offered, ministers preached of triumph over Satan. The rope tightened, the body dropped, and the community sighed in relief until the next name was spoken, and the performance began anew. The deaths themselves carried symbolic weight. Bridget Bishop, the first to hang, was condemned not just as a witch but as an example. She was executed in June, her body swinging as a warning to all who might resist. Each subsequent hanging reinforced the message: dissent was deadly. The executions grew bolder. Multiple prisoners were hanged together, their bodies lined along the scaffold like trophies of righteousness. Families were forced to watch as parents, siblings, or spouses were silenced forever. Children sobbed in the crowd as the community chanted prayers over the dying. The gallows had become Salem's stage, and the audience demanded curtain calls. The afflicted girls fed on this attention. Their role as holy victims made them untouchable. They sat in the center of every trial, their words carrying more weight than scripture, their convulsions treated as sacred testimony. In a world where they had once been powerless, they now controlled life and death. Their performances grew more elaborate with each session, escalating in intensity to hold the court's attention. The court itself thrived on the theater. Judges who presided over the trials gained prestige as defenders of the colony. Their reputations grew with each execution. To question the girls was to risk undermining the entire spectacle, and so they encouraged it. Questions were framed to elicit drama. Accusations were paraded in front of crowds. Confessions were staged as climactic revelations. For the villagers, the trials became both horror and entertainment. Attendance swelled at examinations and executions. Families packed into the meeting house, whispering and gasping at every shriek. Merchants sold food and drink outside the courthouse. What had begun as fear had transformed into ritualized spectacle. Salem's suffering had become Salem's pastime. The human cost of this theater was immense. The accused endured not only the threat of execution, but also the humiliation of being reduced to characters in someone else's play. Their dignity was stripped away in front of neighbors who once broke bread with them. They became props in a narrative that demanded their destruction. The most tragic aspect of this theater was how thoroughly it consumed the community. Children were encouraged to participate, repeating accusations and mimicking the fits of older girls. Parents rewarded them for their bravery. Ministers praised them from the pulpit. Each new performance reinforced the hysteria, until it seemed impossible to escape. But theater thrives on escalation, and Salem was no different. The more people were accused, the more spectacular the trials had to become to hold attention. Simple fits were no longer enough. The girls began to describe elaborate visions, witches flying through the night, shadowy meetings in the woods, spectral animals clawing at them in the dark. The stories grew more dramatic because the audience demanded it. As the summer of 1692 wore on, Salem's theatre of hysteria reached its height. Executions multiplied, confessions poured in, property was seized, families were destroyed. The village had surrendered entirely to performance, mistaking spectacle for truth, screams for evidence, and executions for justice. This was not justice at all, it was theatre at its most grotesque, and Salem had become addicted to the show. While the meeting house became a theatre of hysteria, another stage lay hidden in the shadows, the jails, behind barred windows and rotting wooden doors. The accused endured a different kind of torment, one that rarely made its way into official records, but gnawed at their bodies and souls long before they reached the gallows. Salem's jails were not designed to hold hundreds of prisoners. They were crude, overcrowded, and reeking of human misery. Men and women, young and old, were shackled in chains so heavy they could barely move. Straw pallets rotted beneath them. Vermin crawled across the floor. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, mold, and human waste. For many, the prison itself was a slower death sentence than the rope. Families of the accused faced their own torment. To keep loved ones alive behind bars, they had to pay fees to the jailers, fees for chains, for food, for water, even for the right to visit. Every day drained families of their meager savings. Livestock was sold, fields went untended, and children starved, all to keep mothers and fathers alive a little longer. Salem's hysteria was not just spiritual warfare, it was financial ruin. In these conditions, confessions were forged like weapons. The magistrates and ministers knew the prisons themselves could break the spirit. Sleep deprivation, starvation, and constant interrogations wore down even the strongest resolve. Prisoners were told that confession meant life, while denial meant death. Each night they lay in darkness, hearing the sobs of fellow inmates, the rattling of chains, the scratching of rats in the corners. Every sound reminded them that the only way out was to surrender. The most insidious part of the system was how it made confession the price of survival. Those who confessed were often spared the gallows, at least temporarily, but confession was never enough on its own. The accused were required to name accomplices. To expand the circle of guilt, confession became a chain reaction, one lie sparking another, one desperate survivor condemning the next. For the magistrates, this was invaluable. Each new name confirmed the existence of a vast conspiracy. Each new accusation justified further arrests. The prisons filled with men and women, whose only crime was being caught in the widening net of suspicion. The psychological torture was immense. Consider Mary Warren, one of the original accusers. When she faltered and tried to tell the truth, admitting that the fits and visions might be false, she quickly found herself accused. Dragged into the courtroom, she was pressed until she broke. Surrounded by girls who had once been her companions, she recanted her doubts and returned to her role as accuser. The trials had corrupted even those who had once wielded power, turning them into tools of their own destruction. For others, the pressure came from family. Wives begged husbands to confess, so their children would not be left destitute. Parents urged children to lie so they might be spared. The accused faced an impossible choice: hold to the truth and meet the rope, or surrender to falsehood and live as the betrayer of neighbors and kin. Salem had made honesty a death sentence and deceit the only hope of survival. The cruelty extended beyond adults. Children as young as 4 were imprisoned, forced to endure the same filth and hunger as their elders. Dorothy Good, the daughter of Sarah Good, languished in jail for months, her small body chained, her mind shattered by fear. She was too young to understand why her mother was called a witch, too young to grasp why she was punished alongside her. For Dorothy and others, the prison was a place where innocence itself was shackled and broken. Among the most notorious tools of coercion was the so-called touch test. Afflicted girls would claim to be tormented in court until the accused laid hands upon them, at which point the fits would miraculously cease. This was treated as scientific proof, though the outcome was entirely controlled by the accusers. It was theatre disguised as evidence, a trap impossible to escape. To refuse the test was guilt. To comply and fail was guilt. To succeed was also guilt, for it proved the accused had some unseen power over the afflicted. Inside the prisons, the accused whispered to each other, shared scraps of bread, prayed in the dark. Some tried to hold firm, believing that God would deliver them. Others broke, weeping as they confessed to crimes they never committed. Each broken spirit was a triumph for the system, another cog in the machinery of hysteria. The sheer number of prisoners overwhelmed the colony. By August, over 200 people had been accused. Jails from Salem to Ipswich groaned under the weight of bodies. The colony struggled to feed them all, though jailers continued to collect fees from desperate families. Some prisoners died before trial, their bodies wasting away in the stinking darkness. Their deaths were not counted among the executions, but they were just as much victims of Salem's madness. The pressure to confess corrupted even the meaning of faith. Ministers urged prisoners to admit their guilt, claiming it was better to save the body than risk the soul by denying the obvious. Yet when the condemned stood on the gallows and proclaimed their innocence, they were branded as liars hardened by Satan. The spiritual authorities of Salem had transformed themselves into agents of coercion, bending theology to justify murder. For those who endured, the wait for trial was as cruel as the trial itself. Shackled in darkness, they listened as news of fresh executions spread. Each name called meant another neighbor gone, another proof that the court would not relent, and still, the magistrates demanded more confessions, more names, more evidence for their endless performance. The prisons of Salem revealed the hidden cruelty of the trials. The gallows claimed the bodies, but the jails claimed the souls. Confession was no longer a matter of conscience. It was a weapon, forged in filth and fear, wielded against the innocent to keep the machine alive. By the autumn of 1692, Salem had become a village where lies were survival, where truth was death, and where the prisons themselves served as factories of despair. And as long as confessions continued to flow, the hangings would never stop. The gallows rose on a rocky outcrop, known as Gallows Hill, a bare ridge that overlooked the town. It was here that Salem staged its most chilling rituals, turning death into a public performance. The condemned were brought in carts, chains rattling as the wheels creaked over dirt roads. Crowds gathered, men, women and children pressing forward to see the spectacle. What awaited them was not justice, but a grotesque ceremony dressed in prayer. Executions in Salem were not carried out in secret. They were designed to be seen, to send a message. Ministers walked beside the condemned, urging them to confess one last time. Sheriffs tightened the ropes. The afflicted girls whose accusations had fueled the trials stood close, shuddering dramatically as though the very presence of witches weakened them. The crowd watched in rapt silence as each life ended, a mix of fear, fascination, and morbid excitement. The spectacle intensified in September, when 8 were executed in a single day. The hill bristled with ropes, the bodies lined in a grim tableau against the sky. Families wailed as loved ones were cut down and denied Christian burials. The corpses were discarded in shallow graves, some later dug up by relatives under cover of darkness. Death was not only public, but dishonorable. To be condemned as a witch was to be erased, body and soul, from the community you had once called home. Each execution deepened the stain on Salem's soul, yet the crowds kept coming. Parents brought children, treating the gallows as a sermon in flesh and blood. Ministers used the moment to preach of righteousness and the dangers of sin. Every death became a parable, twisted to reinforce the hysteria. Salem was devouring its own, and the people applauded. But cracks began to show. With every hanging, doubts grew louder. Some whispered that the trials had gone too far, that too many respected citizens had fallen. Others asked why confessed witches were spared while the defiant innocents were killed. The contradictions gnawed at the edges of belief. If the devil was everywhere, why did the executions not end his power? If these deaths were cleansing the village, why did the fits of the afflicted only grow worse? Still the machine of death rolled on. The gallows creaked, the bodies swung, and Salem continued its descent, one execution at a time. By the autumn of 1692, Salem's witch trials had consumed nearly every corner of village life. More than 200 people had been accused, dozens executed, and still the hysteria showed no sign of ending. Yet, in the very act of devouring the weak, the frenzy had begun to turn toward the strong. When the circle of suspicion reached the elite, the machine of hysteria began to falter. At first, it was subtle. Whispers touched families of higher standing, merchants with wealth, ministers with influence. But the turning point came when the afflicted girls dared to point their fingers at Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of Massachusetts's governor, Sir William Phipps. The governor had tolerated the trials while they consumed beggars, widows, and troublesome neighbors. But when the madness threatened his own household, the tide shifted. Salem's hysteria had climbed too high up the social ladder, and now it risked toppling the very men who had profited from it. Governor Phipps intervened. He ordered an end to the use of spectral evidence, that flimsiest of proofs which had convicted so many. Without it, the machinery of accusation lost its most potent fuel. Suddenly the shrieks of the girls no longer guaranteed a guilty verdict. The weapon that had condemned ministers, grandmothers and farmers was stripped from the court's hands. Judges, once so eager to preside, began to hesitate. Magistrates, who had thundered about Satan's army, now spoke more cautiously. Doubts rippled through the colony. If spectral evidence could be dismissed so easily, how many innocents had already died because of it? Salem had built its gallows on shadows, and now the shadows were evaporating. Outside the courtroom, unrest grew louder. Families of the condemned spoke openly of injustice. Ministers debated in sermons, some insisting the trials had gone too far, others clinging to their righteousness. Merchants grumbled as trade faltered, fields went untended, and the colony's reputation rotted. The trials that had once unified Salem in fear were now tearing it apart. The executions of September had been the bloodiest, 8 lives taken in a single day, but after that, the gallows fell silent. The machinery stalled, gears grinding without fuel. For the first time, the court released prisoners instead of condemning them. Some who had languished for months in chains stumbled home, broken in body and spirit, but alive. Yet the damage was irreversible. Families had been ruined, property seized, reputations destroyed. Children returned to empty houses where parents no longer lived. Fields stood abandoned, farms collapsed into debt, and the colony carried the weight of dozens of innocent dead. Even those freed bore scars that never healed. Chains had left marks on their wrists, disease had hollowed their bodies, and neighbors still looked at them with suspicion. The afflicted girls, once untouchable, began to lose their grip on the community. Their performances no longer drew the same awe. Where once the crowd gasped and prayed, now they muttered. Some began to suspect the girls had fabricated everything. Others whispered that Satan himself had tricked the court into killing the innocent. The spell of hysteria was breaking. Cotton Mather and other ministers scrambled to protect themselves. They had once thundered from pulpits that the trials were God's work, but now they shifted their language, insisting they had only sought justice, that mistakes had been made by others. No one wished to stand in the shadow of Salem's gallows. Responsibility was passed like a plague, each leader hoping the blame would settle elsewhere. In October, Governor Phipps formally dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer, the special tribunal that had overseen the witchcraft cases. A new court was established, one that quietly released many prisoners and dismissed charges for lack of evidence. The executions stopped not because Salem found its conscience, but because its leaders feared the chaos had gone too far. But what of those who had already died? Their families were left to pick up the pieces. Wives returned to homes stripped of land. Children bore the shame of being called witches' kin. Husbands labored in fields once prosperous, now poisoned by suspicion. Salem tried to move on, but the scars were carved too deep. The collapse of the trials revealed an unsettling truth. The same system that had eagerly consumed the powerless crumbled the moment it threatened the powerful. Justice had never been the goal. Control had, and once control was endangered, the machine was dismantled. Yet even in its end, Salem offered no true reckoning. The dead were not immediately exonerated. The families of the condemned were not compensated. Ministers and magistrates did not stand trial for the blood they had spilled. Instead, the colony slipped into uneasy silence, pretending the nightmare had been an unfortunate mistake rather than a crime. The executions had ended, but Salem was forever changed. The gallows still stood on Gallows Hill, silent but heavy with memory. Fields and homes lay abandoned, ghostly reminders of families erased, and the whispers continued, not of witches this time, but of injustice, of shame, of wounds that would never heal. The trials had collapsed under the weight of their own corruption, but the lesson remained. Fear had been enough to make neighbors turn executioner, enough to make courts abandon truth, enough to make a colony strangle itself in the name of purity. Salem had devoured itself, and all that was left was silence. The gallows had gone silent, the courts dissolved, and the prisons slowly emptied, but Salem's wounds did not heal with the end of the trials. They deepened. What remained after the hysteria was a landscape of ruin, families broken, reputations destroyed, and a community that could never again look at itself without shame. For the survivors, the nightmare never ended. Men and women who had confessed under pressure lived with the weight of their lies. They walked through their village, carrying the knowledge that they had condemned neighbors to the rope in order to save themselves. Their silence afterward was not relief, but torment, a lifelong reminder of what fear had forced them to do. The families of the executed bore even heavier burdens. Widows were left penniless after property was seized. Children were branded with the stigma of being witches' kin, mocked, avoided, or denied opportunities. Entire households collapsed into poverty, not because of curses or devils, but because their community had chosen to strip them bare. Even those who had participated in the trials carried scars. Some of the afflicted girls lived long enough to regret their roles. Anne Putnam Jr., one of the most active accusers, eventually offered a public confession years later, acknowledging that her testimony had been false. She begged forgiveness, calling herself deluded by Satan, but her words could not bring back the dead. They were an echo in a village still haunted by the weight of its crimes. Ministers and magistrates attempted to rewrite the story. Cotton Mather and his allies claimed they had only sought to serve God, shifting blame onto the devil for deceiving the court. Few admitted the truth, that they had abandoned reason for power, and sacrificed innocence for control. The leaders who presided over Salem's darkest year protected themselves with words, while the common people lived with the silence of empty chairs at their tables. Years later, small gestures of restitution began. In 1711, the colony officially reversed the judgments against some of the condemned and offered financial compensation to their heirs. But no payment could replace lost lives. No proclamation could erase the terror that had consumed a community. Salem's name would forever be tied to the trials, its history inseparable from the noose. The true legacy of the witch trials stretched far beyond New England. They became a symbol of what happens when fear overrides reason, when authority bends to hysteria, when justice is weaponized by ambition and resentment. Salem was not unique. Europe had burned thousands in its own witch hunts, but Salem's horror was compact, compressed into 1 year, and carried out in a society that prided itself on piety and order. Its scale made it unforgettable. Its intimacy made it unforgivable. The lessons of Salem echoed into later centuries. During times of crisis, suspicion and paranoia returned in new forms. Neighbors once again turned on neighbors. Leaders once again justified cruelty as righteousness. From political purges to cultural panics, Salem's ghost lingered, a reminder that the machinery of fear could be rebuilt at any moment. For the people of Salem Village, memory itself became dangerous. Many avoided speaking of the trials at all, hoping silence might bury the shame. But silence cannot erase history. The names of the condemned lived on in whispers, in church records, in the land itself. Gallows Hill remained a scar, an unholy ground where the earth had swallowed innocence. Centuries later, monuments would rise to honor the victims, their names etched in stone as a warning to future generations. Pilgrims would come to Salem, drawn by fascination and horror, walking the same streets where neighbors once accused each other in whispers that led to death. Salem became a place where history itself served as a ghost, a town forever bound to the nightmare it had birthed. The most haunting truth of all is that Salem was not about witches. There were no demons in the fields, no pacts signed in blood, no midnight flights through the sky. The devil that tore Salem apart was not supernatural. It was human fear, human envy, human cruelty. The people of Salem built their own hell, stone by stone, with suspicion as mortar and fear as fire. The true horror of Salem was not witchcraft. It was what ordinary men and women will do to each other when fear is given power. The gallows have long since crumbled. The judges are dust, the accusers buried beside their victims. But Salem's story endures, not as a tale of superstition but as a warning that fear, once unleashed, can devour even the most faithful, the most rational, the most ordinary among us. Salem was not an exception. It was a mirror, and what it reflects should terrify us still. So when we speak of Salem, we are not telling a story of the past. We are telling a story of every time and every place where fear triumphs over truth, where power masks itself in virtue, where the innocent are condemned because the guilty demand it. Salem is not gone. Salem is waiting, in every shadow where fear grows louder than reason, and that is why we must never forget. You've just walked through the full descent of Salem, from the first whispers in a minister's kitchen, to chains in the jails, to bodies swinging on Gallows Hill, and finally to a legacy of fear that still stains history. Most channels would sugarcoat the story, but Shrouded History exists to drag the truth behind these buried horrors back into the light, the forgotten tragedies, the royal scandals, the stories they never dared to teach you in school. Every week, we uncover the darkest chapters of history, the ones ignored, erased, or deliberately hidden. Help us keep these stories alive. Like, subscribe, and share. because shrouded history is the only place where the past still whispers and the dead still speak.